This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about the moment he refused to let me die. Max had never barked like that before, not once in 5 years. But now, on a quiet morning in the hills, his voice cut through the air like a warning. It wasn't a playful bark. It wasn't even a protective one. It was sharp, focused, and relentless. His golden fur bristled, and his eyes were locked onto the mouth of a dark cave, partially hidden beneath a curtain of vines and moss. Miguel stood a few steps behind, confused and uneasy, gripping the leash loosely in one hand. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and for the first time in years, their daily walk didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something was wrong. Miguel watched Max closely. The dog wasn't moving, wasn't sniffing the ground like usual. He was frozen in position, ears twitching, his body tense, eyes wide. "What is it, Max?" Miguel asked, his voice low but shaky. He stepped forward, following the line of Max's gaze. The entrance to the cave yawned like a wound in the side of the mountain, dark and still. Max let out another bark, louder this time, and then lunged forward, pulling the leash taut. His paws scraped at the ground, dragging Miguel a step closer to the opening. "Hey, stop!" Miguel called, but Max wasn't listening. It was as if something inside the cave was calling to him, something urgent. Miguel's heart thumped hard against his chest. Max had never behaved like this before, not even when wild animals crossed their path. There was something different today, something he couldn't explain. Still gripping the leash, he hesitated. His rational mind told him to turn back, but Max kept barking, scratching, and pushing forward. Miguel looked down at his companion and realized something simple and terrifying. Max wasn't afraid. He was determined. Whatever was in that cave, Max needed Miguel to see it. With a deep breath, Miguel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, and he activated the flashlight. A narrow beam of light sliced into the darkness, revealing only jagged rock and silence. Miguel swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Let's see what's in there." Max stopped barking, just for a second, and looked back at Miguel with eyes that seemed to say, "Finally." Then he turned and padded into the cave without hesitation. Miguel followed, his footsteps echoing with every step. The further they went, the colder it became. Dampness clung to the air, and the sound of their breathing was the only noise breaking the silence. The flashlight flickered as it moved across the uneven walls, catching glimpses of long-forgotten stone and thin roots snaking downward from above. Max walked ahead confidently, occasionally glancing back to make sure Miguel was still behind him. Miguel couldn't help but notice how the shadows on the wall danced like ghosts, each one whispering secrets the cave had held for centuries. After several minutes of cautious walking, Max suddenly stopped. He stood at the edge of a narrow passageway that opened up into a slightly wider chamber. Miguel caught up, panting slightly, his pulse still racing. "What now?" he whispered. Max didn't answer, of course, but his nose pressed to the ground, and he let out a low whine, something between worry and discovery. Then Miguel heard it too, faint, barely audible, a sound that didn't belong to nature. It was a soft, muffled sob. Miguel froze. The flashlight trembled slightly in his grip. "Hello?" he called, voice cracking in the cold air. There was no reply, just a faint echo, followed by another whimper. It was closer this time. Definitely human. Definitely a child. Miguel's breath caught in his throat. "Max!" he whispered, eyes wide. But Max had already turned toward the sound, ears up, tail low, moving forward. The cave was no longer just a cave. It was a mystery and a cry for help. Miguel moved carefully, every step feeling heavier than the last. Max led the way, his body low to the ground, nose twitching with every breath. The narrow tunnel opened into a small chamber, and there, crumpled against the far wall, was the source of the sound. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, sat huddled with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her wide, terrified eyes catching the beam of Miguel's flashlight like twin mirrors reflecting all the fear in the world. Miguel's heart clenched. Without thinking, he dropped to one knee, careful to keep a safe distance. He didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was. "Hey there," he said softly, voice shaking but gentle. "It's okay. We're here to help." Max, sensing the delicacy of the moment, approached slowly, wagging his tail in slow, calming sweeps. He lay down a few feet away from her, resting his head on his paws as if to say, "You're safe now." The girl blinked, her lower lip trembling. She glanced between Miguel and Max, uncertainty flickering in her small face. Finally, in a voice so small it was barely audible, she whispered, "Sophia." Miguel smiled, a rush of relief warming his chest. "Hi, Sophia. My name's Miguel, and this here is Max. We're going to get you out of here, okay?" Sophia nodded hesitantly, but when she shifted, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Miguel noticed the way she winced and immediately spotted the problem. Her ankle was swollen badly, the skin around it bruised and tender. He leaned forward cautiously. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Sophia pointed to her ankle with a trembling finger. Miguel nodded in understanding. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll take it slow." He reached into his backpack, pulling out a bottle of water and a small cereal bar. Sophia accepted them gratefully, sipping and nibbling as if they were the finest meal she had ever tasted. Watching her, Miguel felt a heavy wave of emotion roll over him. She had been alone in the cold, terrifying dark, and yet she was still fighting, still hoping. After a few moments, Sophia's breathing steadied, and she managed a fragile smile at Max, who responded by inching closer and gently nuzzling her side. The girl giggled quietly, the sound like a fragile crack of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Miguel knew they couldn't stay there for long. The air was getting colder, and the storm outside would only make things worse. "We need to get you back to your parents," Miguel said softly. Sophia's eyes widened with hope, but quickly clouded with worry. "I got lost," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I went exploring, and then the rain started, and I couldn't find my way back." Miguel's heart broke at the helplessness in her words. He nodded solemnly. "It's okay. Max and I found you, and we're not leaving you behind." Carefully, he shifted his backpack, slinging it over one shoulder to free his arms. "Can you lean on me?" he asked. Sophia nodded bravely, trying to stand but nearly crumpling with pain. Miguel was there instantly, offering his shoulder, steady and strong. With Max leading the way once again, they took their first cautious steps back into the maze of darkness. Every echo, every drip of water from the ceiling above sounded amplified in the silence. The darkness felt thicker now, pressing around them with invisible hands. But Miguel kept moving forward, driven by a singular purpose: to bring Sophia safely back to the world she had been torn away from. Somewhere deep inside, Miguel felt a strange certainty. This was no ordinary cave. There were secrets here, ancient and heavy, but for now, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was Sophia, one careful step at a time. They began their long, uncertain journey toward the light. The cave seemed to close in around them as they moved forward, each step echoing with the weight of uncertainty. Miguel kept one arm wrapped firmly around Sophia, her small frame leaning heavily against him with every step. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Max walked ahead, alert and focused, sniffing the ground and pausing at each fork in the path. The flashlight's beam danced over the damp stone walls, catching glimpses of hanging roots and glistening droplets of moisture that clung to the cave's ceiling like silent sentinels. Miguel tried to keep calm, but his thoughts were racing. How long had Sophia been down here? How far were they from the surface? And more importantly, how long before the storm outside got worse? A low rumble echoed faintly through the rock, reminding him that time was not on their side. The storm was still raging, and judging by the vibrations beneath their feet, it wasn't slowing down. They moved carefully, turning down a narrow path that Miguel hoped would lead them closer to the entrance. But just as he began to recognize familiar stone formations, a sudden flash of light pierced the darkness ahead. For a moment he felt hope, a glimmer that they were near the exit. But as they stepped into the wider corridor, that hope was shattered by what they saw. Rain poured outside in thick sheets, a violent cascade of water battering the trees beyond the cave's mouth. The wind howled like a living thing, bending branches and ripping leaves from their roots. And then came the sound that made Miguel's heart sink, a deep, splintering crack, followed by a thunderous crash. A massive tree trunk, thick and soaked, came crashing down just meters from the entrance, slamming into the earth with terrifying force. The path out was now partially blocked by a wall of bark and branches, and the storm showed no signs of mercy. Miguel tightened his grip on Sofia, who clung to him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "What are we going to do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Miguel didn't answer right away. He stared at the twisted wood that now stood between them and the outside world. It wasn't just a fallen tree, it was a message. They weren't getting out that way. Before Miguel could form a plan, Max began barking. Loud, urgent. He ran to the back of the cave, turned, and barked again, his body tense with purpose. Then he dashed a few feet deeper and stopped, turning once more to look at them. Miguel followed Max's gaze. The path he stood before wasn't one they had taken earlier. In fact, Miguel hadn't even noticed it before. It was narrow, low, and half concealed by hanging vines, a hidden tunnel. Miguel felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Max, what are you doing?" he muttered. But Max just barked again, louder, more insistently. He wanted them to follow. Without hesitation, Miguel adjusted his grip on Sofia and stepped toward the new passage. The choice had already been made. The way back was gone. The only way now was forward, into the unknown. They entered the tunnel, the air colder here, thinner somehow. A faint glow shimmered ahead, something unnatural and soft. Miguel kept the flashlight trained low to avoid tripping, but he could already tell. This was no ordinary cave. There was something else in here. Something waiting. The further they walked into the new tunnel, the more unreal everything began to feel. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air turned cool and damp, yet somehow alive. Miguel held Sofia close, steadying her every time her foot caught a loose stone. Max led the way in silence now, ears perked, eyes scanning every shadow. The faint glow ahead grew stronger, soft and bluish, like moonlight reflecting on still water. But there was no source Miguel could see, at least not yet. The narrow path curved sharply and then widened unexpectedly into a large open chamber. Miguel stopped short, stunned. Sofia gasped softly beside him. Even Max seemed to pause in silent awe. They had stumbled into something breathtaking. The ceiling of the cavern rose high above them, covered in jagged crystals that shimmered with that same ghostly blue light. It wasn't artificial. It wasn't man-made. It was as if the cave itself glowed from within, a secret the earth had kept hidden for centuries. In the center of the chamber was a small underground lake, perfectly still. The glowing crystals reflected off the water's surface, scattering dancing lights across the stone walls. For a moment, nobody moved. They just stood there, silently overwhelmed by the beauty around them. It didn't feel like a rescue anymore. It felt like they had crossed into another world. Sofia whispered first. "It's magic." Miguel looked down at her and then back at the shimmering walls. "Yeah," he murmured. "It really is." They made their way to a dry, flat spot near the water's edge. Miguel carefully helped Sofia sit down and used his backpack as a makeshift pillow. Max curled up beside her, gently resting his head on her leg. She stroked his fur with a shaky hand, her breathing finally starting to slow. Miguel sat a few feet away, silently watching the lights ripple across the ceiling. His mind was racing, yet still. How could something like this exist? Had anyone ever seen it before? The chamber was untouched. There were no signs of human presence. Just nature, raw, beautiful, and ancient. It felt sacred. He stood slowly and walked toward the far wall, flashlight still in hand. That's when he saw them. Faint outlines, nearly invisible in the dim light. Paintings, etched into the stone with weathered strokes. Human figures, animals. Symbols he couldn't begin to understand. And in the center of them all, a strange image. A creature with the body of a man and the head of a wolf. Miguel stared, heart pounding. It didn't feel like myth. It felt like warning. A soft moan broke the silence. He turned quickly. Sofia stirred in her sleep, face twisted in discomfort. Miguel rushed to her side, gently touching her shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe." Her eyes opened slowly, still wet from dreams. "I saw my parents," she said, voice fragile. "They were looking for me, but I couldn't reach them. Miguel's throat tightened. "They're looking for you, Sophia, and we're going to find them." Max stood up suddenly, ears alert again. He let out a low growl, not of threat, but attention, focused and certain. Miguel's breath caught. Something was coming, something close. A voice, faint, distant, echoing off the stone walls. Then another, a woman's, calling a name. "Sophia." Sophia's eyes widened. She sat up straighter, wincing as her ankles shifted, but her voice came out loud and clear. "That's my mom! That's my dad!" Her tiny hands clutched at Miguel's arm, her whole body trembling with sudden energy and hope. The cave, once a place of fear and mystery, now echoed with something else, familiarity. Miguel quickly helped her to her feet, letting her lean fully against him, while Max stood at attention, barking sharply toward the passage they had come from. The voices were closer now, clearer. A man shouting Sophia's name, a woman crying out in desperation. It was them. Miguel didn't question it. He didn't ask how they had found the right path or how they had reached this hidden chamber. Some part of him didn't need the logic. Some part of him knew the cave itself had led them all together, just as it had led Max. Footsteps, fast, heavy, echoing against the walls, bouncing through the chamber with a rhythm that matched the pounding in Miguel's chest. And then, two flashlight beams cut through the shadows, followed by the figures of a man and woman. Mud-streaked, exhausted, frantic. When they saw the girl in Miguel's arms, they froze for half a second. Then everything collapsed. Sophia cried out, reaching forward. "Mom! Dad!" Her mother was the first to break, dropping her flashlight and sprinting forward, tears streaming as she fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Her father was just a step behind, voice choked with emotion as he pulled them both into a tight embrace. For a long moment, none of them spoke. There was no room for words, only tears and trembling hands and breathless disbelief. Max circled around them, tail wagging, as if proudly confirming his mission had been completed. Miguel stood back, silently watching the scene unfold. A strange sensation washed over him. Relief, yes, but also something else. Something like distance. Like he was part of it all, but not really. An observer, a protector who now faded into the background. Eventually, the father turned to him. His face was worn, his eyes red, but there was something deep behind them. Gratitude. "We have no word," he said quietly. "I'm Roberto. This is my wife, Anna. Thank you for finding her." Miguel smiled faintly and nodded. "It wasn't me, it was Max," he said, patting the dog, who looked up as if he understood every word. Anna looked around for the first time, her eyes adjusting to the glowing chamber. Where are we?" she asked, her voice soft, filled with wonder and fear. Miguel explained as best he could. The storm, the cave, the blocked path, the hidden tunnel, the glowing crystals and the ancient paintings. Roberto, who revealed he was a doctor, gently examined Sophia's ankle. "It's a sprain," he confirmed. "Painful, but we'll manage it." As the family held one another close, the reality of the situation settled back in. The storm outside still raged. The path was still blocked, and this chamber, for all its beauty, was still a place of uncertainty. They had found each other, but they weren't out yet. Miguel knew the next decision would matter just as much as the one that brought him into the cave to begin with. They had to wait, for the weather, for the light, for the strength to leave. But for now, Sophia was safe, and that was everything. As the minutes passed, the initial wave of emotion gave way to practical urgency. The storm outside, though slightly weakened, still howled through the forest, making escape too dangerous, especially with Sophia's injured ankle. The ground would be slick, the terrain unstable. One wrong step could bring disaster. Roberto, relying on instinct both as a father and a doctor, suggested they stay put until dawn. "We need rest, and we need light," he said firmly. "Trying to move in the dark is a mistake." Miguel nodded in agreement. There was no point in risking more danger when they had shelter. Strange and mysterious as it was, they gathered their limited supplies and began setting up a temporary camp in the glowing chamber. Anna used her coat as a blanket for Sophia. Miguel offered his extra shirt as a pillow. Max lay curled beside Sophia once again, his presence as steady as a heartbeat. As quiet returned to the chamber, Miguel found himself drifting toward the ancient cave wall. The images, still faint but present, pulled at something inside him. He raised the flashlight, tracing the lines again. A group of figures stood around what looked like a creature, not human, not fully animal, part guardian, part hunter. Around them were symbols that meant nothing to him, yet stirred something deep in his chest. Roberto joined him, following his gaze. "These paintings," he murmured, "they're not random. They tell a story. This place, it's sacred." Miguel didn't respond right away. He stared into the patterns, wondering how long this chamber had been hidden, how many people had passed within feet of it, never knowing. "What if we're not supposed to be here?" he finally asked, almost to himself. Roberto took a breath, his voice thoughtful. "Or maybe we were meant to find it, but not share it." Silence fell between them. Not an awkward silence, but something weightier, a shared understanding. They both knew what they were saying without needing to say it. This place was untouched, pure. If word got out, it would never be the same. Tourists, scientists, media, all of them would pour in, stripping away the magic and replacing it with curiosity and control. Sophia, still resting, seemed to understand too. She looked up from Max's fur and said quietly, "Maybe some things should stay secret." Her words carried more weight than anyone expected. Miguel turned to look at her, surprised by the clarity in her voice. It wasn't a childish statement. It was an observation, wise beyond her years. Anna sat down beside her daughter and took her hand. "You're right," she whispered. "Some things are too special to be explained." That night, as they settled against the glowing walls and listened to the softened rumble of the storm, an unspoken agreement formed. A pact, bound not by signatures or promises, but by the experience they had shared. They would protect this place, not because someone told them to, but because they had felt its power, and they understood what it meant. The cave wasn't just stone and crystal. It had offered shelter, safety, wonder, and something deeper. It had connected them, not just to each other, but to something larger, something unseen. And as they drifted to sleep in the heart of the earth, they knew that leaving this chamber wouldn't mean forgetting it. It would mean carrying its secret in their hearts forever. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of silence that lingers after chaos, where even the wind seems unsure of its place. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a bruised forest and a restless tension in the air. Soft daylight crept through the cave's entrance, merging with the faint blue shimmer of the crystals, giving the chamber another worldly calm. Miguel sat up slowly, careful not to wake Sophia, who was still resting with Max beside her like a silent guardian. Roberto and Anna were already up, exchanging a look that said everything. They needed to leave. Miguel stepped to the cave's edge and froze. The ground outside was no longer familiar. The rain had torn into the hillside, carving deep gashes into the earth. Not far from the mouth of the cave, a ravine had opened, wide, jagged, and fresh. His breath caught. One wrong step could be fatal. He turned back and spoke quietly. "It's bad. We'll need to be careful." Together, they helped Sophia stand, wrapping her in Anna's coat. Max took the lead, moving carefully, while the rest followed in silence. Each footstep had to be earned. Miguel could feel the soil shift under his boots, soft and dangerous, like the land was waiting for someone to make a mistake. Miguel's eyes scanned every inch of terrain, but it was no use. The moment came fast and without mercy. The ground beneath him cracked with a wet snap, and in an instant, he was falling. His foot slid out from under him, his body twisted sideways, and the edge of the slope gave way. He managed to push Sophia toward Anna with a final shove before he dropped. Air swallowed him. The world tilted. Gravity seized his chest, and just when he thought he was gone, Max lunged. The dog's jaws locked onto Miguel's sleeve, his paws buried deep in the mud, trembling with effort. He didn't hesitate. He didn't let go. Miguel's arm jerked back hard, his shoulders screaming in pain, but he held on. Anna cried out. Roberto dove and grabbed Miguel's other arm, fighting the pull of the slope. Man and dog, side by side, straining against nature itself. The ground slipped further beneath Max's paws, but he snarled, growled through clenched teeth, refusing to lose his grip. Roberto's fingers dug into Miguel's wrist with white-knuckled focus, and then, with one final desperate pull, they yanked him back from the edge. Miguel collapsed on the ground, chest heaving, face caked in mud, disbelief flashing in his eyes. Max sat beside him, coated in dirt, breathing heavy but steady. He didn't bark or whine, he just stared at Miguel, calm and certain, like he had done exactly what he came to do. Miguel met his eyes, voice breaking as he whispered, "You saved me." But those words felt too small for what had just happened. This wasn't just about instinct. This wasn't about a trained response. It was something else. Max had made a choice, a conscious, fearless choice, to protect, to fight, to hold on when it mattered most. In that moment, Miguel didn't just see his dog. He saw something greater, something almost sacred, a silent protector, forged not by commands but by bond. The cave had tested them. The storm had broken the land, but Max had stood between Miguel and the inn, and that act alone would never be forgotten. The hours that followed passed in silence, broken only by the sounds of breathing and the occasional shift of someone adjusting on the uneven ground. The forest outside remained damp and quiet, no longer howling, just dripping, recovering from the storm's fury. As daylight strengthened, Miguel felt a quiet certainty settle over him. It was time to leave. Sofia's parents had already begun preparing for the climb out, and Miguel was busy testing the safest angles of the slope. The path remained treacherous, but passable. The ravine that nearly claimed him was behind them now. But something else lingered, a heaviness. Not of fear or exhaustion, but of something harder to name. Before they moved, Miguel found himself turning back to the cave chamber one last time. The soft blue glow, the crystal-lined ceiling, the ancient paintings etched into stone. It all looked exactly as it had when they found it. And yet it felt different now, more personal, more sacred. He wasn't sure if it was the place that had changed or just the people leaving it. Sofia was quiet as they began the slow journey down the hill. Her small arms looped around her mother's neck while Roberto led the way with careful steps. Miguel walked at the rear, keeping an eye on Max, who remained alert and steady, his pace measured, his head turning from side to side like he was still protecting something unseen. They moved carefully through the battered forest, stepping around fallen branches and uprooted trees, each of them lost in their thoughts. No one spoke of the chamber. No one discussed what they had seen. It was as if the cave had imprinted something unspoken into all of them. Miguel didn't feel like they had escaped a storm. He felt like they had walked through a test and passed. As they reached flatter ground, the air began to change. Distant sounds returned, birds chirping, the distant rustle of wind, and then the unmistakable thump of helicopter blades. The rescue teams were close, very close. Miguel exchanged a look with Roberto, and without saying a word, they both understood the same thing. There would be questions. Within minutes, searchlights swept through the clearing. Voices called out names. The first responders rushed forward, surrounding Sofia's family with urgent hands and concerned expressions. Anna broke down in tears, clutching Sofia tight, while Roberto gave short, breathless answers to the flood of inquiries. Paramedics moved in with blankets and stretchers, and still no one said a word about the cave. When one rescuer asked where they had sheltered, Miguel simply pointed toward the woods and said, "We found a dry spot and waited it out." That was all. That was enough. He glanced at Max, who stood quietly beside him, still muddy, still calm. In that moment, Miguel realized the truth. The cave hadn't just protected them, it had chosen them. What happened inside didn't belong to the world, it belonged to them. As the helicopter prepared for takeoff and the noise of the outside world wrapped itself around them again, Miguel allowed one final glance toward the forest behind. There was no visible path, no glowing light, no trace that such a chamber had ever existed. But they knew, all of them did, and some secrets, once shared between the right souls, never need to be spoken again. The noise of the helicopter faded behind them, swallowed by the trees and the silence that followed. The storm had passed. The forest was still again. But the people walking out of it were not the same as the ones who had walked in. Miguel didn't speak much during the ride back. He sat beside Max, resting one hand on the dog's back, feeling the rise and fall of each breath. Sophia lay wrapped in blankets across from them, eyes half closed, her mother's arms holding her gently as if she still feared losing her. Roberto sat beside them, quiet, eyes fixed on the floor of the aircraft. No one mentioned the cave. No one spoke about the glowing chamber or the paintings etched into stone. The bond they had formed was quiet but strong. It was sealed not by words but by what they had endured together. And Miguel, who had entered the forest that morning as just a man with his dog, now felt like he was part of something deeper, something sacred. Back at the edge of town, emergency responders swarmed around the landing zone. Cameras were kept at a distance. Reporters asked questions that no one truly wanted to answer. Miguel watched from the sidelines as Sophia was taken into a waiting ambulance, Roberto climbing in behind her. Anna stopped for just a moment and turned back. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke loud enough. It was gratitude and something more, a connection forged in fear, in trust, and in survival. Miguel gave her a small nod. He didn't need the words. Max sat beside him, ears perked, eyes always scanning, still in guardian mode. And in that moment, Miguel realized that Max hadn't just saved his life. He had guided them all, through darkness, through danger, through a place that seemed untouched by time or reason. Whatever it had been, whatever power the cave held, it had chosen Max as its messenger, and Max had chosen Miguel. Later that night, as Miguel sat on the floor of his quiet home, Max resting peacefully beside him, the memory of the cave returned in fragments. The glow of the crystals, the echo of distant voices, the roar of the storm. The moment Max clamped down on his sleeve and refused to let go. Miguel leaned back against the wall, his hand gently stroking the dog's fur. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew where to go, what to do. You knew before I ever did." Max didn't move, but Miguel could feel his breathing, steady and calm. That was the thing about Max. He never needed to speak. He just acted, always present, always loyal. Miguel closed his eyes and let the silence settle over him. No longer heavy, but peaceful. The world would keep spinning. People would keep asking questions. But some stories weren't meant to be retold. Some were meant to be remembered quietly, held close like firelight in the dark. The cave was gone now, swallowed by time, maybe even forgotten by the earth itself. But what it left behind in them, in Max, in Sophia, in all of them, could never be undone. Days passed, but the feeling didn't fade. Miguel went back to his daily routines, walking with Max along familiar paths, returning to his quiet life. But something in him had shifted. The hills felt different now. The trees whispered in a new language. And every time Max paused near a trail or stared off into the woods for too long, Miguel couldn't help but wonder if he was remembering it too. That other world hidden beneath the earth. The cave was gone, buried, lost to the eye, but not to the heart. It lived in memories now, silent and sacred. The kind of memory that doesn't just sit in your mind, but lives in your bones. He never tried to explain it to anyone. What would he even say? That a cave had opened itself to them, that a dog had led them into light and darkness at the same time, that an ancient place had wrapped around a little girl and refused to let her die. Some truths are too powerful to survive words, so he kept it all inside. He still saw Sophia's family once. It was a week later, outside the hospital. Anna spotted him first. She smiled, walked straight to him, and pulled him into a quiet embrace. No reporters, no cameras, just human warmth. Roberto shook his hand firmly, holding eye contact longer than most people do. "You changed our lives," he said simply. Miguel shook his head. Max did. And then from behind her mother's legs, Sophia peeked out. She was walking now, slowly, carefully, a small brace around her ankle. When she saw Max, she beamed. The dog walked forward, tail wagging softly, and Sophia knelt with effort, wrapping her arms around his neck. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There was a moment of stillness where Miguel felt like the air itself paused to watch. Then Sophia whispered something into Max's ear that no one else heard, and the dog gently licked her cheek before backing away. Anna offered a quiet thank you. Roberto nodded once more, and then they left. no fanfare, no retelling of the story. Just a final look between souls who had survived something too deep to describe. That night, Miguel stood at his kitchen window, sipping tea, Max resting by the door. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like tiny reflections of the crystals they'd seen deep underground. He thought about that chamber, about the ancient markings and the way they had glowed not just with light, but with meaning. He thought about the pact they'd made without speaking, the choice to leave it untouched. There had been power in that silence, not weakness, not fear, but respect. He glanced down at Max, who lifted his head as if he'd been listening the whole time. "We won't forget it," Miguel said, "but we'll keep it where it belongs." Max's tail thumped once, soft against the floor. That was all, and Miguel smiled faintly, knowing the truth. The story they'd lived would never be written, never be shared, but it would live forever in the heart of a man, a girl, her parents, and the dog who led them home. In the weeks that followed, Miguel found himself avoiding questions. People had heard bits and pieces from news reports, twisted retellings from distant sources, fragments stitched together by those who hadn't been there. Some said Sofia had been found in an old ranger cabin. Others claimed a search party had guided her out just in time. But none of it was true, and Miguel never corrected them. When people asked how he knew where to look, he simply shrugged and said, "Max led me." That much at least was true. But the rest, the cave, the glowing chamber, the strange feeling of being inside something ancient and alive, he never spoke of it again. He had made peace with the truth remaining hidden. It wasn't meant for the world. Some stories aren't meant to be shared. They're meant to be carried. Miguel returned to work, back to quiet routines and early walks with Max through the same hills where it had all begun. And though everything looked the same on the surface, Miguel saw it all differently now. The trees weren't just trees. The wind wasn't just wind. There was something underneath it all. A hum, a rhythm, a presence. Some days Max would stop in his tracks and stare off into the woods for minutes at a time. Miguel never rushed him. He simply waited, letting Max listen to whatever the earth was telling him. There were moments where Miguel wondered if the cave still existed somewhere under their feet, waiting for the right soul to stumble upon it again. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had found it when it mattered most. It had answered a call no one else could hear, and Max had been the one to listen. One evening, while sitting on the porch with Max resting at his feet, Miguel opened his notebook. He didn't write a full account, didn't record every detail, but he did write one sentence. Just one. "He pulled me back." That was it. No names, no dates, just truth. A quiet line for himself. A reminder of the moment that defined everything. Then he closed the notebook and set it aside. In that silence, Miguel understood something more clearly than ever before. It wasn't the cave that had changed him. It was what it revealed. The strength of loyalty, the weight of instinct, the power of love that doesn't need words. As he looked down at Max, now older, slower, but still watching him with those same knowing eyes, Miguel felt nothing but gratitude. They had walked through darkness together and emerged with something eternal, and that was enough. The seasons began to shift. Spring gave way to the warmth of summer, and the forest turned lush and alive again. Miguel found comfort in the rhythms of the earth, the morning walks, the long silences shared with Max, the quiet peace of days untouched by drama or noise. But even in that peace, the memory of what they had been through lingered. It wasn't heavy in a painful way. It was gentle, like a shadow that walked beside him. He thought of Sofia often, sometimes wondering if she still remembered the glow of that hidden chamber, or the feeling of Max curled up beside her when she had been too scared to breathe. He didn't reach out, and neither did they. But that didn't mean they weren't connected. They had all seen something no one else had. They had made a silent promise, one deeper than words. Miguel didn't need reminders. The experience had marked him in ways that didn't fade. He began writing more, not for publication, not even for anyone else to read, just for himself. Little pieces of memory, a feeling here, a scent, the sound of water dripping in the darkness. He'd sit for hours with Max at his side, letting the past settle into sentences, even if those sentences never left his notebook. Some memories were too sacred to share. One afternoon, after writing a short passage about the moment Max refused to let go of him, Miguel paused and closed the notebook. He looked out across the hills and whispered, "You gave me back my life." Max, lying peacefully nearby, thumped his tail once and exhaled deeply. It was enough. They understood each other in ways that went beyond speech. And it was in that moment Miguel thought of all the people out there. Those who'd never know the kind of bond he and Max shared. The ones who might be walking through something dark, not knowing if anyone would pull them back. So if you've ever felt that connection or long for it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your voice matters here, and your support keeps these quiet, powerful moments alive. The air that evening was still. The sun dipped low, casting long orange shadows across the hills. Miguel watched the last light fade as Max sat beside him, head tilted as if listening to the world's final whisper of the day. Miguel reached down, ran his fingers through Max's fur, and smiled. "We're different now," he said softly. "But that's a good thing." Max nudged his hand gently in return. They didn't need another adventure. They didn't need anyone else to validate what they had seen. Sometimes the most important journeys don't end with applause or recognition. They end with understanding, with peace. And as Miguel closed his eyes and leaned back into the fading day, he knew they had been given something rare, a story the world would never know, but one that would stay alive in every quiet moment, in every step they took together from now on. There was something about returning to the same trail after everything had changed that made Miguel walk slower. The old path hadn't moved, but he no longer looked at it the same way. Each bend, each fallen log, every whisper of wind through the trees felt like a reminder. Nature didn't speak in sentences, it spoke in echoes. And every so often, Miguel could feel something stir beneath his feet. Not literally, but deep in his awareness, like a presence waiting beneath the surface. He wondered if the cave still existed somewhere down there, sealed by time, invisible to the human eye but not forgotten by the land. He never searched for it again. Some doors, once closed, shouldn't be forced open. Still, the memory lived with him every day. It wasn't a memory like others. It didn't fade. It didn't drift. It stayed sharp, clear, like the feeling of Max's teeth locked on his sleeve, refusing to let him fall. Max had slowed down over the months. He didn't run ahead on walks like he used to. His joints stiffened in the mornings, and he slept more in the afternoons. But the fire in his eyes never left. He still sat at the door when the wind picked up, alert, ears forward, watching a world Miguel could never fully see. Sometimes Miguel caught him staring at nothing, just a patch of woods, a corner of sky, a stretch of dirt trail. But Miguel had learned to trust that gaze. It wasn't empty. It was tuned into something deeper, something unseen. One evening, while resting under a pine tree, Miguel looked over at Max and whispered, "You still hear it, don't you?" Max didn't react. He just kept staring into the forest, breathing calmly. And somehow, that was the answer. Miguel leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the silence fill him, letting the memories settle into place like stones beneath water. What they had lived through wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't dramatic or romanticized. It had been hard, cold, wet, dangerous, real. And yet, within all that chaos, they had found something sacred. They had found light in darkness, a little girl lost and found, a family reunited, a bond deepened by instinct and love. Miguel didn't need to explain it to anyone. The only one who ever truly understood had been beside him the whole way. Max, quiet and constant. The dog who listened when no one else could. The protector who had known the path long before Miguel did. And now, as they moved through the quiet rhythm of life again, Miguel carried something with him that the world could never take. Not proof, not fame, just truth. A private, powerful truth that had shaped his heart forever. There were still days when Miguel woke with a jolt, heart racing, mind replaying the fall, the storm, the sound of Max's bark echoing through the darkness. The cave had faded from the news, replaced by other headlines, other disasters. But it had never left him. It lived inside him like a quiet fire, warming his chest every time he looked at Max. He didn't see a pet anymore. He saw the soul who had stood between him and death. the one who had sensed a cry for help no one else heard, the one who had pulled him from the edge, literally and otherwise. Friends sometimes joked that Miguel treated Max like a person. They didn't know the truth. Max had made choices. He hadn't acted on command. He had moved with purpose, felt danger before it arrived, and answered a call that no human could. And in Miguel's eyes, that made him more than just a dog. That made him a being of his own kind, one forged in loyalty, instinct, and something ancient that couldn't be explained. Miguel began volunteering part-time at the local rescue shelter. He didn't tell anyone why. He just showed up with Max, helped walk the nervous dogs, clean cages, talked quietly to the ones who flinched at every movement. People noticed how the dogs responded to Max. Even the most scared ones calmed down when he was near. He had a stillness in him, a calm certainty, as if he were passing on what he had learned in that cave. The lesson of trust, of being there when no one else shows up. Miguel watched it unfold and knew it was no accident. Max hadn't just survived something miraculous. He had come back with something, a deeper awareness, a wisdom that didn't require language. And Miguel, without realizing it, had started to carry it too. Not just the memory, but the responsibility to protect, to show up, to pay forward what had once been given to them in their darkest hour. In quiet moments, when the house was dark and the world outside had gone still, Miguel would sometimes find Max lying near the window, gazing up at the stars. It seemed like he was listening to something only he could hear. Miguel would sit beside him, neither of them speaking, and just breathe. They didn't need words. They had shared something beyond that. And in those silent, starlit pauses, Miguel felt whole. Not because everything made sense, but because it didn't need to. The mystery was part of the gift. They had walked into the unknown and come back not with answers, but with a bond that could never be broken. It wasn't about what they found in that cave. It was about what they found in each other. And no matter how much time passed, no matter how far they moved from that day, Miguel knew one thing would never change. Max had saved his life. But even more than that, Max had given it meaning. Time moved forward in small, steady ways. The seasons turned again. Leaves returned to the trees, and life settled into something soft and stable. Miguel had never been one to chase recognition, but after everything that had happened, he found himself appreciating the stillness more than ever. Mornings with Max were slower now. The walks were shorter, but richer somehow. They would pause at familiar spots. Places that once held no meaning now held layers of memory. Miguel noticed how Max would sometimes stop, lift his head, and simply listen. It wasn't for sounds of danger. It was for something deeper. And Miguel listened too, not with his ears, but with his presence. Together, they walked like old souls who had returned from someplace unspoken, connected by something greater than time or explanation. Neighbors sometimes asked Miguel if he would ever write a book about what happened. He always gave the same soft smile and said no. Some stories aren't for books, he'd reply. They're for hearts. And that was how he treated it, with quiet reverence. It was never about retelling the cave story. It was about living by what it taught him. He became more patient with people, more present. He helped a stranger fix a flat tire without needing thanks. He spent time sitting beside an elderly man on a bench, just listening, not talking. He didn't do these things to be noticed. He did them because he knew what it meant to be lost and found again. He knew what it meant to be held back from the edge by something or someone who simply refused to let go. That experience didn't need to be spoken aloud. It lived in his actions now, in the way he moved through the world. Max, too, had changed in quiet ways. Though slower and older, his presence had grown deeper, as if the journey had settled into his bones. He still carried himself with a quiet strength, still had that same knowing look in his eyes. Miguel often thought about how people misunderstood animals, how they measured them by tricks and obedience rather than heart and spirit. Max had never been trained to save lives. He had simply known how. He had felt the call before anyone else had, and that was something no amount of training could ever teach. Miguel looked at him often and thought, he's not just my dog, he's my witness, the only living being who knew exactly what had happened, exactly how it felt, and exactly why it mattered. In that way, Max was more than a companion. He was the keeper of the story, the one who never needed to tell it, because he had lived it. It was on an unusually warm autumn afternoon that Miguel noticed just how much slower Max had become. They were sitting beneath their usual tree near the far edge of the walking trail, a spot where few people ever wandered. The light cut through the leaves in golden strands, painting Max's fur in soft halos. Miguel had brought water, a blanket, and the same notebook he always carried now, not to write the full story, but to remember the feelings it left behind. Max rested beside him, head lowered, eyes half closed, but alert in that quiet, observant way that had never left him. Miguel watched him breathe, the rise and fall of his chest slower than before. It didn't alarm him, but it did make his chest tighten. Time was moving, not in a loud, painful way, but in that subtle, irreversible way that life always moves, whether we're ready or not. They stayed like that for hours, neither of them speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Miguel had learned that the greatest conversations weren't made of words. They were made of presence. He remembered the cave, the light, the fear, the trust, the moment Max had pulled him back with nothing but his will to keep him alive. And he thought about how much of his own courage had been born in Max's shadow. That thought alone filled him with a quiet kind of gratitude. Miguel turned the page in his notebook and wrote only a single sentence. "Even when I was lost, you saw me." He looked over. Max was watching him now, not for food, not for commands, but simply watching. A soft breeze passed between them, carrying leaves and the scent of pine. It felt like the forest itself was breathing with them. Miguel leaned back against the tree trunk and whispered, "I don't know how to thank you, but I think you've always known." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass. Miguel stood and stretched, his joints cracking slightly from sitting too long. Max didn't move at first, and Miguel waited patiently. Eventually, the dog rose slowly but steadily and walked beside him. They didn't take the long trail home that day, just the short one, the one Max always liked most. As they walked, Miguel thought about the things they'd shared, how trust had replaced fear, how silence had become sacred, how one act of loyalty had changed not just a moment, but an entire life. He didn't need to tell the world what had happened in that cave. He only needed to remember it and carry it forward, not through storytelling, through living, through kindness, through paying attention to what others overlook. And as he walked with Max that day, the leaves crunching gently beneath their steps, he felt it again, that sense of meaning that only comes when the world is quiet enough to let the truth rise. One morning, as the first chill of winter began to settle into the hills, Miguel woke to find Max sitting quietly at the back door, staring out at the horizon. It wasn't unusual for him to do that, but something about the way he sat there felt different. His posture was calm but still, as though waiting for something only he could sense. Miguel walked over and opened the door, letting the cold air slip in. Max stepped out slowly, pausing at the edge of the porch. The sky was overcast, soft gray clouds rolling overhead, and the wind carried a sharpness that hinted at the coming snow. Miguel followed him outside, hands deep in his coat pockets. They stood together in the silence. No birds, no passing cars, no movement. Just the wind, the land, and whatever memory Max was chasing across the horizon. "You feel it too," Miguel said softly. Max turned his head slightly, meeting his eyes for just a second. That was the answer. They walked that morning, but only part of the way. Miguel knew Max didn't have the strength for the full loop anymore. His steps were slower, his breathing deeper, but there was no pain in his movement, just age, wisdom etched into muscle and bone. Miguel never tried to push him. They took breaks when Max needed them, and in those quiet pauses, Miguel would talk. Not with full stories, but with fragments. "Remember the moss?" he'd say. "How it smelled like rain." Or, "Do you think anyone else has seen what we saw?" Max would listen in stillness, never needing to answer. It became their ritual, a way to honor what they had lived through, not by reliving it, but by letting it settle into the rhythm of their days. Max didn't need reminders. He had been there, and Miguel never felt alone in remembering, not with Max beside him. That night, as the first flakes of snow fell quietly across the porch, Miguel sat by the fire. Max curled beside his chair. He reached down and ran his fingers gently through the dog's fur, now streaked with white and silver. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has," he said. "You gave me my life back." Max didn't stir. His breathing was slow, steady, peaceful. Miguel stayed like that for a long time, watching the flames dance in the hearth, the memories flickering behind his eyes. Some experiences carve themselves into your soul, not like scars, but like light. The cave, the storm, Sophia's cry in the dark, the weight of Max's grip on his sleeve. All of it lived inside him, like music that never stopped playing. And as he looked down at the dog who had once pulled him from the edge, Miguel understood one simple truth. The moment had passed, but the meaning would never fade. Max was not just part of his story. Max was the reason it existed at all. Winter deepened, and with it came the kind of quiet that settles deep into the bones. The air outside grew sharper, the days shorter, and the walks became fewer. Max still rose each morning, still waited by the door, still looked out across the hills like he was watching something far beyond the visible world. But Miguel saw the difference. The pauses grew longer, the effort heavier. His eyes still sparkled, but there was a tiredness in them now, a softness that hadn't been there before. Miguel didn't speak about it. He didn't ask questions or try to pretend it wasn't happening. Some things don't need words, they just need time. And Miguel gave him that. Every minute, every quiet hour beside the fire, every slow walk under a pale sky. He knew the moment was approaching, not with fear but with reverence. You can't outrun time, but you can honor it. And Miguel was going to make sure Max's time was never anything less than sacred. One morning, Max didn't get up. He wasn't in pain. He wasn't struggling. He simply didn't move. He lay on the blanket by the fireplace, his breathing slow and steady, eyes half closed as if in the middle of a dream he didn't want to wake from. Miguel knelt beside him, placed a hand on his chest, and stayed there. No panic, no tears yet, just presence. He whispered, "You don't have to keep holding on for me. I'm okay, I promise." Max's eyes opened just enough to meet his. Then they closed again. That was all. Miguel didn't try to call a vet. He didn't rush or plead or interrupt the peace that had wrapped itself around the room. He just lay down beside him, one arm draped gently over his best friend's side, and listened to the rhythm of a life that had been the heartbeat of his own for so long. And as the morning light crept in through the window, soft and golden, Max took one final breath and let it go. There were no grand goodbyes, no dramatic final moments, just love, quiet, steady, enduring. Miguel stayed by his side long after the breath had faded, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of the moment pass through him without resistance. The world outside continued like nothing had changed, but Miguel knew better. Something enormous had ended, something irreplaceable. Later, he wrapped Max in the same old blanket they had taken on every trail, every journey, every memory they had made together. He buried him beneath their favorite tree, the one overlooking the valley. No stone, no plaque, just a promise spoken in a whisper. "I'll carry it from here." And he would, because what Max had given him couldn't die. It had taken root in his spirit, in his choices, in the way he'd forever see the world. Max hadn't just saved Miguel once. He had taught him how to live. And even now, long after the silence returned, Miguel knew that kind of love doesn't end. It just changes form and walks beside you, unseen but never unfelt. Spring returned quietly, as if mindful of the absence it now filled. The trees began to bloom again, the hills greened with life, and the trails Max once loved slowly opened beneath Miguel's feet. He returned to them, not to relive the past, but to honor it. At first, the walks felt hollow. Every sound, every scent, every curve in the path reminded him of what was missing. But over time, something else began to take root. It wasn't pain, it was presence. Miguel started noticing how Max had changed the way he saw the world. He paused longer at the bend where Max used to stop and listen. He crouched beside streams Max once drank from. And though the leash was no longer in his hand, Miguel still walked like he was never alone. The rhythm of those quiet steps became sacred again, not because of the loss, but because of what still remained. People often say dogs leave paw prints on your heart, but what Max left behind was something deeper. He had rewired how Miguel responded to life, how he listened, how he waited, how he loved. Even simple things were different now. A stranger dropping their groceries prompted Miguel to help without hesitation. A fearful dog at the shelter made him kneel lower and wait longer. Max had not just changed his direction once. He had altered the course of how he moved through the world. Miguel found himself more patient, more aware, more present. And though no one around him knew the full story, they could feel something in him. A stillness, a kindness, a depth that didn't come from books or teachings, but from experience. From one extraordinary bond that had taught him what it meant to truly show up for another life. He often found himself speaking to Max out loud, especially during those early morning walks. Not out of grief, but out of habit, like the conversation had never truly ended. "You'd love this breeze today," he'd say, or "that squirrel would have made you crazy." And sometimes when he closed his eyes just long enough, he could almost hear the soft rhythm of paws beside him, steady and true. The cave was a memory now, tucked deep into the corners of his soul, but the story it gave him, what it awakened in him, was alive in everything he did. Max was gone, yes, but what he left behind had become part of Miguel's foundation. Not a shadow, not a ghost, a guide. And in that quiet knowing, Miguel found peace. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because the love had never left. Years passed, but some memories never softened. Miguel grew older, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair grayer, his pace slower. But the trail remained. The hills, the winding paths, the curve where Max once barked toward the unseen mouth of the cave. It was all still there. And Miguel walked it often, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. Each step reminded him that the past hadn't vanished. It had simply become part of him. The world had moved on. Few remembered the storm or the missing girl. Fewer still remembered the man and the dog who had disappeared into the forest that day and come back changed. But Miguel never needed the world to remember. He carried the story in every quiet act of kindness, in every moment of patience, in the steady way he lived his life, not loudly but meaningfully. The cave had been a place of danger, of discovery, of mystery. But Max had been the miracle. Sometimes children would stop Miguel on the trail and ask about the old dog in the photograph he always kept in his notebook. He'd smile, pat the picture gently, and say, "That was Max. He was my best friend." Some asked if Max was a hero. Miguel would nod. He saved someone who was lost, and then he saved me too. That was all he ever said. That was all he needed to say. The photo stayed clean, protected between two pieces of worn plastic. A simple shot, Max sitting in the grass, ears up, eyes sharp, the wind brushing through his fur. Miguel never added words beneath it. The story lived in the spaces between the silence, in how he showed up for others, in how he waited with calm, in how he never let anyone feel alone when he could stand beside them. Max had taught him that, and in carrying it forward, Miguel kept his friend alive, not as a memory, but as a presence. One morning, as the sun crested over the hills and the wind moved through the trees like a whispered song, Miguel stood at the edge of the clearing where he had buried Max. He didn't speak. He didn't kneel. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, breathing in the soft chill of dawn. A single beam of light pierced through the clouds, touching the ground like a quiet blessing. And Miguel smiled. The ache was still there. It always would be. But it had become something beautiful. Something he would carry forever. Not just love, but proof that love, when given without condition, never truly dies. It simply changes form, moving through us in the way we walk, the way we care, the way we show up when someone is lost. As Miguel turned to leave, the wind picked up slightly behind him, and in that breeze he felt it, just for a moment, the soft rhythm of unseen footsteps beside him, the echo of loyalty, the whisper of a promise kept. And that was enough. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you've loved, someone who never let go, then like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support helps us keep sharing moments that matter. And remember, some heroes walk quietly on four legs, but their impact echoes for a lifetime.